as oftentimes when we begin these discussions, I want to go back and say a few things about what we covered the last time we met, which was, the structures of an exhibition. We talked about the really incredible work that was done by Vladimir Shukov in cooperation with Alexander Body, using the 1896 Nizhny Novgorod exhibition as a frame of reference for talking about the celebration that went on the part of the autocratic state to draw attention to the incredible technological, scientific, and industrial products that had emerged over the course of about the last 18 years or so in the Russian Empire, during this period when we had talked about it in the lecture preceding that, Russia's industrial takeoff, right, which takes place more or less under the direction of Sergei Witte, and leads to incredible growth in Russian industrial production, the expansion of existing industries, the creation of brand new industries, the petroleum industry, the steel industry, the electrical industry, and things along those lines. The Nizhny Novgorod exhibition was designed to celebrate that. And as we talked about toward the end of our time together, the last time we met, it really was a propaganda set piece. I talked about it being what I refer to as compensatory symbolism. This is not to say that there were not real achievements. That's why I spent as much time as I did talking about Shukov. The collaboration that he and Body had for about 20 odd years or so really was remarkable, in my opinion, every bit as comparable to what you would have expected from an Edison or a Westinghouse. At the close, however, of our time together, I mentioned an alternative view of that exhibition, and that was the alternative view that came from, a writer by the name of Maxim Gorky. Right, so here's Gorky on the right, Sergei Witte on the left. Gorky, who was a journalist at the time, a newspaper correspondent, put together 60-odd essays about the exhibition and had a very different view of what was going on. He is the one who's going to look at the working class, at the poor, at the downtrodden. So the contrasting views of the exhibition that were expressed by Witte, who sees it as a celebration of the autocratic state's ability to master modern technology and really to master the emerging modern era. His view versus Gorky's view that this was, in many respects, flim-flam, right? The exhibition itself had nothing to offer the lower classes. He considered it to be a facade. A facade that really was covering up the injustice and the degradation that so many ordinary Russians suffered from. So these two contrasting views of the exhibition expressed by Witte and Gorky are really indicative in broad terms of the contrasting attitudes that are present in the Russian Empire about not only about technology and science, but about the direction of the nation as a whole at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Russia's privileged estates, represented by Witte, the ranks of its laboring poor, represented by Gorky, their views, are the incredible contrast of at the opposite ends of the spectrum. And I guess you can fill in that spectrum with everything, from conservatives on the right that support the autocracy, liberals on the left that are going to at least profess a concern for the lower classes on the side of the left. So as Russia's 20th century is dawning, state leaders, elite patrons of science and industry, they're going to continue to invest technological progress with what I would call iconic significance. They see railroads, telegraphs, and other modern systems as the means, but both as symbols and the means of Russia's transfiguration into a modern, technologically advanced state. State patrons, members of the autocracy are going to hold fast to these views. They are convinced that by mastering machines, mastering technology, building a knowledge economy, Russia is going to be able to surpass the levels of achievement established by Germany, by Great Britain, by the United States. Now, one of the things that was curious about Russian technological culture at the time is that Russian elites tend to contrast their knowledge of technology and science, or at least their familiarity with it, with the ignorance that would be displayed by what they would refer to as the nekulturni, or the uncultured masses, right, who occupy the lower depths. Press outlets at the turn of the century, well into the first decade of the 20th century, reinforced this view by publishing comical stories about befuddled villagers encountering technologies, motor cars, driving or coming near provincial towns and settlements, and the peasants sort of coming out and being frightened by them. We see stories from time to time being published of peasants encountering hot air balloons that have flown off of their intended course, and they attack the balloons because they believe they've been sent by the devil. So there's a real dichotomy in the viewpoints of technology at the turn of the 20th century. And I want to talk about today, to begin with, the way in which historians and scholars have come to understand that the lower classes envision technology, because these different experiences of the technology and science give us, I think, a really interesting way of exploring the widening divide, or the widening gap between the educated elites, in particular those educated elites who are going to support the state, and there are educated elites who don't, of course, but the difference between the educated view and sort of the view of, in particular, the urban factory workers, who are a very small fraction of the Russian population, but it's the urban factory workers who, by 1900, 1901, 1902, are the ones who are most closely associated on a daily basis with these technologies, at least from the standpoint of factory settings. The encounters of workers with the thunderous equipment, right, that was driving Russia's industrial takeoff, is ultimately going to serve as the inspiration for revolution. Their experiences led most, the experience of the working class led most of the working class to regard technology not as a way of saving Russia, but as something that was threatening and harmful. Very few, if any, industrial laborers shared the triumphalist visions espoused in the exhibition catalogs from 1896. Very few among them really could muster anything positive to say about these modern technologies and their mechanized systems. Now, not surprisingly, in essays, short stories, and poems written by literate members of what we might call the proletarian intelligentsia, and we put that in scare quotes. This would be the rising numbers of the literate urban working class. So they're not all literate, they're not all illiterate, excuse me. And we're going to talk a little bit more later today about technical schools and things like that that are opening up for members of the lower class. But as members of the literate working class produce their own essays and poems and short stories and novels, they're going to draw inspiration for their writings from the factory floor, from the urban factories. And they describe these technological settings as locations of thunderous noises and whistles, of deafening roars, of stifling fumes of smoke and dirt. And you can imagine how grimy the industrial working place was, say in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. One, a second generation lathe operator by the name of Alexei Bibek would write in describing the factory, quote, as a soulless din in which, quote, thundered like a steam engines and gears and transmission belts thundered like a huge cauldron filled with thousands of sounds pouring together in an unbroken, anguished, and hopeless howl. Okay, so some of these poems depict factories and working places as almost living, terrible monsters They were said to howl and snarl like wolves. The factories were vampires that sucked the blood and the souls out of those who worked in them. So elite patrons see technology as a path to national salvation. A lot of workers viewed this technology as a road to perdition. And given the circumstances under which so many of these workers operated, it's easy to understand why. Negative attitudes towards technology on the behalf of the laboring poor came about because industrial enterprises at the turn of the 20th century, especially in Russia, were very dangerous places. They were filled with noxious fumes. They were jam-packed with rapidly moving machinery. The machinery posed innumerable opportunities for the losses of limbs or even one's life. Workers at the turn of the 20th century in Russia had little recourse in the event that they were injured. Most were denied a legal right to insurance. If you were injured, you say you lost an eye or you lost an arm in an industrial accident, the most that you might hope to receive from your employer was a couple thousand rubles and termination. So you'd lose your job. Russian industrialists at the turn of the 20th century exercised almost complete authority over their employees. If you think about the way that serfs were treated, and in many respects, peasants were still continuing to be treated, right? Even though they had now been emancipated, urban workers were treated in many respects very much like serfs. Right? They were subjected to a range of humiliating punishments. You could be flogged, for goodness sakes, if you were an industrial worker, for violating an infraction on the shop floor. You also had to endure all sorts of common indignities, invasive personal searches. Body searches were not unusual. These were undertaken allegedly to prevent theft. Another one of the things that workers are indignant about, it's also true for conscripts in the ranks of the Russian army at this time, is in the Russian language, you have two different forms of you. You have a formal and an informal version. So if I'm talking to you as an equal, as someone I didn't know, I would use what is known as the vy form. It's a more formal way of addressing someone, vy, so it'd be vy in English. If you're talking to a subordinate, if you're talking to a child, if you're talking to an animal like your dog, you would address that person or that individual in the form that is known as ty. So the vy and the t, it equates in English to you and thou being the informal, which has now disappeared from modern English usage. But the idea was here that you're going to address, shop floor managers, factory owners are going to address their workers in the same tone, using the same language that they would address children or pets. Now, not all factory workers were like that. Not all factory owners treated their workers like chattel. One exception that proved the rule was our friend Alexander Body, right? The engineer who worked alongside Vladimir Shulkov. Body extended generous treatment to his employers. Laborers at his boiler manufacturing casting plant in Moscow enjoyed some of the very best working conditions in the entire country. There, they had clean, well-ordered plant floor. Wages were about 10% higher than the prevailing wages. The situation for Body's workers was, in fact, very, very good. The Body factories provided workers a free 2-course lunch, including all the bread that they could eat. They got 2 breaks during their 10-hour working day. And during those working breaks, the factory supplied tea and sugar to the workers. The Body extended medical care to the sick and injured. Families of workers who happened to die while employed were given lump sum pensions equal to about 6 months' wages. Yeah, I know that's not a lot, but that was, in the Russian context, very, very generous. Body would insist that these practices were not motivated by humanitarianism. Rather, the engineer argued this was good business practice because money that he invested in his workers, he argued, would be profitably returned to him in the form of higher productivity, better quality products, and lower labor turnover. Now, why would Body think this? Why would he stand apart and be so different from so many other Russian factory owners? Well, he was Americanized, right? Now, I'm not saying that all workers in the United States were treated well, but he was an Americanized engineer who had come to Russia from the United States, and he brought with him a more beneficent. I'm not going to say that that everything was fantastic in the United States. It certainly wasn't, but he had in comparative terms, he had a more enlightened view and a more liberal view of how to treat his workers. But Body was the exception that proves the rule. Workers typically endured ghastly deprivations. The hardest hit, of course, were those at the lowest ranks of the urban labor hierarchy. Oversupply, because you have peasants flocking into the cities looking for work. Oversupply meant that unskilled workers were effectively disposable. Government agents who were assigned to inspect factories did little to alter the circumstances. Laws eventually would be passed prohibiting the nighttime employment of women and children. The working day was limited in 1897 to 11 and a half hours. You couldn't work more than 11 and a half hours after 1897, but there's not a lot of relief here. These were legal decrees, but employers typically bypassed them. They did so by requiring semi and illiterate workers to sign contracts that they really didn't understand, waiving their rights, waiving their legal rights as a condition of employment. I mean, even if you didn't waive your rights, it was just as easy to ignore the regulations because the state inspectors charged with enforcing them lacked the funds to investigate the conditions and do their jobs properly. They could also be bought off with bribes. Officials at the very highest level of government, at the ministerial level, for example, were loath to adopt meaningful reforms that might raise the cost of doing business and thus slow down or retard Russia's booming industrial growth. They were afraid if they raised wages, then the Russian firm's competitive advantage would be lost. One of the things that you all need to understand about having cheap labor is that cheap labor, when you have an abundance of unskilled workers who are flocking into a country or who are flocking into cities, okay, it is going to depress the wages of skilled workers, and it is going to guarantee exploitation of those unskilled workers because they become effectively disposable. Low wages, the low wages paid because you had an oversupply of unskilled workers, were, in the words of Sergei Witte, the fortunate gift of Russian enterprise. Witte would state that the frugal habits of rural life to which Russian peasants were accustomed ensured that their needs could be easily satisfied by prospective employers. In other words, what Witte is saying here is they're so used to living poorly, we can continue to pay them poorly because they're used to living in squalor. And this suppressed wages in Russia because of the overabundance of labor. And that meant that the conditions were poor. And what Witte was saying was not without merit. There were very few peasants who were deterred by the deplorable working conditions they found in most factories. The prospect of industrial employment drew millions and millions of young peasants away from their isolated and monotonous villages into the nation's rapidly expanding cities. Between 1897 and 1917, the number of urban subjects in the empire more than doubled. from about 12.5 million to 25.8, 25.9 million. Now, only St. Petersburg and Moscow had more than 1 million inhabitants. St. Petersburg was about 2.2 million. Moscow was around 1.7 million. But Warsaw, Odessa, Kiev exceeded 500,000. You've got, again, highly concentrated industrial production in Russia. Remember those pockets of progress we talked about weeks and weeks ago. So urban residents comprise only 18% of the empire's total population of 175 million. So it's a small number, the urban population is. It's still overwhelmingly rural, but what's important is that the urban population is concentrated in a relatively small number of large cities. In absolute terms, there were 23 million or so urban inhabitants, 23 million or so urban inhabitants living in European Russia. That was more in absolute terms than the number of urban inhabitants living in France or Italy at the same time. So does that make sense, everybody? You have to understand the way statistics work. And it's clear today that most people don't understand basic statistics. 23 million people overall was more in Russia than the 17 million urban residents in France. But as a percentage of the Russian population, the percentage of the urban population was smaller because France also has a smaller population. Okay, so urban employment held out the prospect for economic gain, for social advancement. In time, peasant recruits might rise up through the ranks of industrial workers to become things like metal workers, lathe operators, printers. These are more skilled positions. And this marked them as members of the urban, what we might call the urban or the labor aristocracy. Most of Russia's industrial workers, however, consisted of migrant workers that were known as охотники. There it is in the chat for you, охотники. These were peasants who came in the off season to these cities, work for a couple of months, and then would return to their village to either bring in the harvest or to sow the fields in the spring. About 9 million strong at the turn of the 20th century, their arrival and their departure placed a lot of strain on the empire's transportation systems and on its urban infrastructure. The охотники, these migrant workers, provided the countryside with vital economic support. They're going into the cities, they're making money, they're bringing money back into their villages, but they're also bringing with them information, what we might call intelligence. They too are part of an emerging knowledge economy that's transferring knowledge, experience, and understanding between the city and the countryside. Now, year-round factory laborers, by comparison, represented a tiny, tiny sliver of Tsarist society. In the first national census conducted in 1897, just over 2 million, or roughly fewer than 2%, because at the time the empire had about 128 million subjects, fewer than 2% of the Russian population consisted of year-round industrial laborers. And those industrial laborers were densely concentrated in major cities, okay, and around railway hubs and regions that were critical to state interests. Now, these are the proletarians, these are the workers who are going to come to exercise an immense influence in economic and political life, grossly disproportionate to their numbers once revolutionary fever strikes the country. So what ends up happening during this period is that you've got a massive influx of people into the cities. You've got some coming and going, but you also have a massive rise in the urban environment in terms of just sheer numbers. And Russian municipalities are no better at dealing with this crisis than French or British municipalities had been adept at dealing with this crisis 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. Municipal governments struggled because they did not have the infrastructural capacity necessary to maintain urban life with this influx of population. Municipal governments were chronically short of funds. They couldn't access credit from the cash-poor imperial government. City leaders took to negotiating costly loans with foreign lenders. So you're borrowing from abroad to undertake infrastructural improvements in some of your major cities. Urban spending on health, education, and public works did increase significantly between the 1880s and the 19-teens. But capital investment routinely focused on modernizing well-to-do commercial districts and administrative districts, as opposed to the outlying industrial areas where most of the workers were concentrated. Does that make sense to everybody? So money's pouring into the cities, but it's not being spent on the working class, where they live, where they work, where they spend their time. Inadequate living conditions is at the very top of the list of miseries affecting the urban poor. Urban housing shortages were endemic everywhere in the empire. Large, hastily built tenements provided very little relief, as owners were looking to maximize profits by crowding as many bodies as you could into subdivided spaces. In Moscow, the population density was nearly double that of London. St. Petersburg was even worse. In 1904, in the capital of St. Petersburg, the average apartment housed 16 people, roughly 6 to a room. Concentrations were even higher in working class districts. The least fortunate souls had nothing more to call home than a wooden bunk in a tightly packed factory barracks. And that's what industrial owners end up doing. They create barracks. You think about how nasty a dormitory might be. These were infinitely worse. They lacked basic amenities. They didn't have kitchens. Many of them didn't have washrooms. They were infested with lice and fleas and other vermin. They amounted to human warehouses in which men, women, and sometimes children were stored by the hundreds. Gorky, Maxim Gorky, would call these, quote, dwellings for a prehistoric people. Inadequate sanitation and water supply were additional problems. Once again, some of the very worst conditions were found in St. Petersburg. In the Vyborg district, which was the city's main working class section, fewer than 1/3 of apartments had toilets or running water in 1904. The result was that excrement piled high in the backyards, unless and until wooden carts came to collect it and move it away at night. Water had to be fetched from street pumps and wells. It had to be boiled in order to make it safe to drink. Throughout the city, there were placards in bold red letters warning people not to drink the water. If you're thirsty enough, though, and if you're one of those recently arrived from the countryside, maybe you couldn't read, didn't pay much attention to them. What happens because of this? If you drink unclean water, all sorts of bad things can happen. Mortality rates in Russia's largest cities were the highest in Europe. The highest in Europe. On average, an outbreak of cholera, which comes from ingesting parasites typically found in feces. The feces works its way into the water supply. Okay, there was a major cholera outbreak in St. Petersburg about every 3 years. The most deadly one would come in 1908, 1909, when it killed 30,000 people. Moscow was Europe's unhealthiest big city. It would endure 4 cholera epidemics, along with 8 outbreaks of smallpox and 10 outbreaks of typhus between 1883 and 1917. In 1910, the infant mortality rate in Moscow exceeded the average Western European level by 50 to 70%. Its overall death rate was 26.9 per 10,000 inhabitants. That was 250% higher than Paris, Vienna, or Berlin. The conditions were very bad. Now, the industrial takeoff contributed to more than just deadly diseases. It's also going to bring about growing social discontent. large-scale strikes by workers at the St. Petersburg Nevsky spinning plant all the way back in 1870. There's another one that takes place at the Kreenholm cotton spinning plant in Estonia in 1872, foretold the arrival of a new European-style type of labor unrest. Now, the czarist ministers are aware of this. They're going to pursue contradictory strategies for dealing with the demonstrations. There are demonstrations, there are work stoppages, there are strikes. These continue as Russia's industrialization unfolds. Official commissions are formed. They're comprised of manufacturers, a smattering of technical and academic experts. They debate, they devise legislative solutions, but these solutions are largely ineffective. So what you have here by 1896, 1900, 1901, 1902 is a perfect storm of rapid industrialization, rapid urbanization, horrible living conditions, a maelstrom of competing interests between the state, the rising would-be members of civil society, the downtrodden urban poor, and the onset of these very first large-scale protests in the 1870s and into the early 1880s are going to end up coinciding almost simultaneously with another momentous but less dramatic event. And that is going to be the introduction of Marxism to Russia's quote-unquote thinking elite. Marxism was the product of the phenomenally prolific and persistently underemployed German thinker, Karl Marx. Marxism began in the mid-1840s as an analysis of advanced industrial society. Marxism emerged at more or less the same time as Auguste Comte's positivism, which celebrated science and the scientific method as keys to unlocking the mysteries of social life and of solving humanity's problems. It was one of the early times in which Western civilization is going to fetishize so-called science. It soon evolved, Marxism did, into a speculative ideological system that claimed to explain through empirical observation and study the material origins, nature, and endpoint of human history. Marxism was coined, allegedly it was scientific socialism, at least in the words of Marx's co-theorist and chief financier, a man named Friedrich Engels. Marxism considered economic relationships to be the determining factor in shaping society's cultural, political, and indeed all of its institutions. But these relationships were not static. Through the dynamic engine of what Marx called the class struggle, or the war between the haves and the have-nots, history had been propelled forward over time through progressive stages to arrive ultimately at its current stage, capitalism. Well, he doesn't call it capitalism. Capitalism as a word doesn't appear in print until 1902. The point of all this was that the large-scale factories that defined the economic systems of Europeans' leading states had made possible technological and productive advances that far surpassed anything that had been achieved by humankind. But amidst this staggering success, Marx theorized, industrial society was sowing the seeds of its own destruction. According to Marx, the exploitation of the urban working class, or what he called the proletariat, by those who controlled the means of production, the so-called bourgeoisie, constituted the internal contradiction that would spark the next revolutionary stage of human development. Marx theorized that proletarians, the working class, would ultimately come to the common realization that the degrading system of capitalist production offered them nothing but continuing misery. Marx theorized that members of the working class would eventually be awakened, they would become woke to their collective plight, to the attainment of something he called class consciousness. At this point, workers would rise up en masse against their bourgeois masters. They would seize the means of production, the factories, through violent revolution. They would establish a so-called dictatorship of the proletariat to redirect the products of industry equitably for the benefit of all. They would run off the bourgeoisie, killing them, chasing them away, and they would oversee, this dictatorship of the proletariat would, the transition to the end point of human development, communism, in which all class distinctions, conflict, and constraints on individual freedom would disappear, thanks to the just society's ability to provide for the material needs of everyone. Does that make sense, folks? You have to understand, you have to have an understanding of Marx to comprehend everything else that happens in the rest of Russian history and to understand what is going on in the world today. Because the way in which Marx thought, his way of thinking, is the way in which would-be putative revolutionaries today think as well. That it is a systemic issue. In Marx's viewpoint, the system was rotten. It had internal contradictions. The proletariat would become woke to its condition, and that wokeness would transcend national, religious, familial. It would transcend all boundaries, and the worldwide proletariat would come together to unite because it was one's identity as a worker, an industrial worker, that trumped every other identity. So what he's prophesizing is that workers will what he means, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. Workers would rise up once they attained consciousness, in other words, awareness of their place within the system. They would overthrow the means of, they would overthrow the bourgeoisie. They would seize the means of production, the factories. And because now the workers are in control of it by themselves, for themselves, all of a sudden, magically, all of the hatred, the animosity, the racism, the sexism, all the bad things, the violence would just dissolve away. And communism would be achieved, and it becomes effectively the endpoint of all of human history. This was peddled and is peddled to this day by people who believe it as quote unquote scientific socialism. Marx claimed to have studied history and to have found empirical proof, factual, irrefutable proof that this is the way things were developing. Now, what Marxism ends up becoming in Russia and becomes for a great many people is a type of secular religion. It's more of a theological viewpoint, far closer to a theological way of thinking than it is a scientific way of thinking. Marxism arrives in Russia at a critical point for the country and for the concept of Marxism. His works are allowed in by Tsarist censors. A copy of Capital, Das Kapital, is going to be translated into Russian. It's a book about this thick. They can't understand it. The censors read it, and it's obtuse. It's abstract. No one's going to read this garbage. So the state censors approve a Russian language publication of Das Kapital in 1872. It was the first time the work had been translated into a foreign language from the German. Within 6 weeks, 900 of the 3,000 initial copies were sold. The rest were snatched up soon thereafter. Government agents realized 10 months later, oh, what have we done? They shut the press down, but it's too late. By then, a whole host of people have read this. Slavophiles, populists, westernizers, liberals. And if nothing else, they accept Marx's stinging critique of the exploitation that you have in a quote unquote capitalist economy. So by the late 1870s, Marxist ideas have infected the minds of most members of the intelligentsia. It's another example of the Tsarist censors making a mistake, as they had done with Radishchev, right? As they would do later on with others. So Marxism ends up emerging as a Russian political movement, thanks to there's Friedrich Engels, thanks to the work of this man, a gentleman by the name of Georgy Plekhanov. He was a former populist, or a former socialist, who believed that Russia's socialist future lay with the peasantry. Let me stop here for a second. I want to make sure you guys understand that there's a distinction here. There are socialists in Russia who hearken back to the tradition of Alexander Herzen. They are known as the socialist revolutionaries. They believe that Russia's future lay in a socialism based largely on the peasant obshchina, or mir. So the future of Russian socialism is going to be a kind of peasant socialism. The socialist revolutionaries are going to focus their efforts on trying to raise the rabble among the peasantry. They are going to be different from the people who Plekhanov encourages the development of. Those are the social democrats. The social democrats are in this context synonymous with Marxists. The social democrats are going to argue that the future of Russian socialism is not in the peasantry, it's in the working class. It's in the working class. That's your revolutionary movement. So the socialist revolutionaries think that the future revolution is going to come from the peasantry. The social democrats think the future revolution is going to come from the working class. Why do the social democrats believe that? They believe that because Marx has argued that the vanguard, the leading edge revolutionary movement that will take the world towards communism is the urban working class, the proletariat. Does everyone understand that? If you have any questions about this, we have to be absolutely crystal clear on this point, or nothing else makes sense from here on out for the rest of the semester. Any questions? All good?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The word from the void. We simply have to understand that. Okay, so let's go back now to Plekhanov. Here's our guy. Now, he was a former populist. He was one who formally, sort of embraced this idea of a socialism emerging from below, from the peasantry. He was a political exile who was living in Geneva, but he saw Marx as the solution. Marxist philosophy was the solution to resolving a dilemma. The dilemma for Plekhanov was, how do you transform an agrarian Russia into a post-capitalist society without resorting to terrorism, the kind of terrorism that had failed to topple the autocracy with the assassination of Alexander II in 1883. So he puts together, along with a group of emigres, put together the first Russian social democratic organization. It's called Emancipation of Labor. In other words, freedom of labor, emancipation of labor. He's going to produce an early pamphlet called Socialism and the Political Struggle. Then he writes a book called Our Differences. These are published in 1883 and 1885. And these advance the idea that although Russia would have to pass through the same development stages as the West, the country, its backwardness meant that capitalism would mature and decay more rapidly than in Europe. What exactly does this mean? No. Marx had theorized that the entire history of humanity was the history of the transformation of the means of production. How things are made, how things are produced, labor, the economy, served as the foundation for every society. Everything else was what he called superstructure. So how labor was organized determined law, it determined family life, it determined religion, it determined politics, it determined culture. You move, very generally speaking, from the earliest hunter-gatherer societies in which labor was divided between stronger, physically stronger men, physically weaker women. The men go out to hunt, hunters. The women gather and do domestic things, right? That's the gatherer side of the coin. Who rules society? The greatest hunters, the greatest warriors. They're going to have subordinates. They're going to emerge as the chiefs. They're going to, hunter-gatherer society's religion is going to be based upon, praying to the gods for the herd of bison to return or the crops in the field to ripen. So everything is going to emerge out of that economic base. The question for the Russians at this point was, because Marx had argued, capitalism, which emerged out of feudalism of the 17th, 18th centuries in Europe, capitalism would eventually give way to socialism. Now, by 1887, 1888, how long has this been going on? It's been going on in England for at least 120 years. So how long is it going to take to get to that stage where you can have the socialist revolution? That's what Plekhanov is saying. He's saying, well, because Russia's coming late. Remember the benefits of backwardness we talked about with the Westernizers and the Slavophiles looking at the European industrialization? Well, because industrialization is coming late to Russia, that period of capital formation, intensive capital exploitation is going to be reduced. So even though Russia's late to the party, we're going to be able to achieve socialism more quickly. We're going to be able to leap over that stage of development much, much faster. This appeals to a lot of Russians, especially young Russians, because youth are always impatient. Youth always think they know everything, right? Oh, socialism is going to work next time. It's never been tried properly. Okay, we're going to see how that works out here in a bit. So what Plekhanov, what his notions instill the hope that by adopting advanced technologies, by learning from the experience of European countries, and possessing a ready-made theoretical basis, Russia could telescope its march towards socialism. And this is immensely popular among young folks because it suggests to them that they will be the revolutionary vanguard of change in their contemporary Russia. Now, the repressive policies that had been introduced under Alexander III had held Marxism in check. It held these radical doctrines in check for most of the 1880s. What changes things is the famine of 1891, 1892. Remember that? The government's inept response is going to generate a great deal of backlash against Tsarism. And all of a sudden, autocratic authority begins being called into question across the board. Student protesters reemerge in force as the university-aged number of men and women, increasingly women, from the Raznochincy, the population of the universities has grown very, very large relative to what it had been. More and more members of the Raznochincy, rather than elite nobles, are now in these schools, and they are going to serve as the key of the oppositional movement. They've got a lot of enthusiasm, they got a lot of energy. And the state, once again, has a real problem. If you grant concessions to the student radicals, that emboldens them. If you repress them, then the apolitical, the ones who don't care, become radicalized. So the autocracy is sort of stuck on the horns of a dilemma here. What do you do? Marx's allegedly scientific socialism is going to prove particularly appealing to would-be revolutionaries who are attending the empire's expanding network of technical schools and polytechnics. These are the chief incubators for Russian Marxism. The most important was something known as the St. Petersburg Practical Technological Institute, which I hope I spelled properly. Close enough. the St. Petersburg Practical Technological Institute. It was the empire's largest technical school. So it's like a polytechnic, sort of kind of. The institute brought upwards of 800 students together under really not very nice conditions. One of the later graduates, who would become a revolutionary leader, a man by the name of Leonid Krassin, would recall that the school, quote, reminded one considerably of more of a factory or plant than anything taking place in a university. A number of engineering students in the 1880s and 1890s are going to form a pioneering circle that combined Marxist radicalism with outreach to the working class in an attempt to raise the consciousness, to make the working class, quote unquote, woke. So when you hear today people talk about wokeness, they're talking about a way of thinking that ultimately owes its origin to Marxism, and particularly Russian Marxism of the 1890s, turn of the 20th century. So these radical engineering students, they go out among the working class, they establish so-called Sunday schools for workers. They're going to teach them how to read. They're going to basically be rabble rousers. They're eventually going to, within 2 years or so, an organizational structure and methods for a conspiratorial social democracy is going to take shape. The institutions, the St. Petersburg Practical Technological Institute's circle of Marxist radicals come to call themselves the technologists. And they systematically train cadres of activists in covert operations. They recruit new members, they lend assistance to the activist comrades. One of those who is going to be indebted to their training is a man by the name of Vladimir Ulyanov. He's indebted to the ideas of this group. He's going to associate with several technologists in the mid 1890s, and these technologists are going to influence how Ulyanov thinks about conspiracies. They're going to influence his mindset. And after 1901, their influence is going to be made manifest as Ulyanov adopts his revolutionary pseudonym, Lenin. So Lenin is going to have his ideas inculcated and incubated by these technologists. Now, here's the thing. It's not just the students. Radical students, as well as professionals in engineering and technical fields, are not immune from the prosecution for the revolutionary activity. But the punishments that are going to be given to them by the state are typically mitigated by the state's desperate need for native experts to support technological modernization. So here's the problem. You have radical students, you're going to have radical teachers as well. The state, their activities are illegal. The state wants to quash them, but if you quash, if you jail, if you exile these people, who is going to teach in the technical schools? And you have to have educated cadres of engineers and technical specialists in order to run the industry and to expand the knowledge economy. Krassin, Leonid Krassin, who I just mentioned, and a couple of other folks, are going to endure several years of prison and internal exile for taking part in the student movement. But both are able to pursue professional careers later on. Krassin is going to work on the Trans-Siberian Railway during his exile to the Lake Baikal region. He returns in 1900. He takes a job in Baku at the oil fields. There, the job was given to him by a radical ex-classmate of his who had served in internal exile with him for a time. And these two guys, Krassin, the other guy's name is Brusnev, are going to play key roles in constructing and operating an electrical generating station that helped modernize the Baku's city oil fields. Does that make sense to everybody? So these are people with radical revolutionary ideas. They're opposed to the autocracy. They're being educated in state schools. They're being radicalized in state schools. They're participating in the student protest movement. Their political views are not, moderating as they enter into their professional life. Once they're in their professional life, they're making money, working for the state. At the same time, they are trying to undermine the state. Krasин would ultimately, this is around 1905, take a position with something known as the 1886 Company, like the year 1886. It was a German-owned subsidiary that was formed to bring electric lighting to St. Petersburg. So while Krassin is working for this cutting-edge firm, bringing a cutting-edge technology to St. Petersburg, he's using his position to raise money and to provide cover for his ongoing conspiratorial activities in support of Vladimir Lenin and Lenin's Bolshevik Party. More about them in a bit. Does that make sense to everybody? Here, this is a serious conundrum for the state. What emerges, Krassin is part of what comes to be known as the electricians' mafia. And it was symptomatic of the societal discontent and the political dysfunction that was plaguing Russia by around 1900. Now, most of the members of what we might call the technical and scientific specialists, most were not conspiratorial Marxists. Okay, but because the state refused to consider even moderate reforms, more and more individuals were driven to embracing radical doctrines. A great example of this is this fellow, Pyotr Palchinsky. He was a graduate of the St. Petersburg Mining Institute, and he began his professional career in 1901 as a member of a commission that was dispatched to the Don Basin, or the Donbass, to investigate why coal production was declining. Senior colleagues looked into operations. He was given a task no one else wanted. And that was the less prestigious task of examining what was known as, quote unquote, the workers' question. So, the senior engineers are going to look at the machines, the process, the procedures. Palchinsky is given the responsibility of looking at the conditions of the workers. And what he discovers is absolutely, horrifies him. Barracks housing upwards of 68 miners to a room, inadequate sanitation, dangerous work conditions. These were the norm. Over a 2-year period, he compiles mountains of photographs, drawings, statistics, indicating that the dreadful conditions under which people labored contributed to industrial inefficiency. Top officials at the Ministries of Finance and Trade receive his report, and they recognize its importance, but they also recognize the implications of his discoveries, that they are politically dangerous. So they don't publish them. They refuse to acknowledge them. Palchinsky would subsequently publish excerpts of his findings in a professional journal on his own. And for doing so, he's dismissed from his commission and sent into administrative exile. So he loses his job by basically being a whistleblower. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, terrible working conditions. Hey, bosses, here are the terrible working conditions. Okay, thanks, file it away. Tries to publish it. Okay, he's going to lose his job. Now, he's a talented man, and in fact, he is a supremely talented engineer. He loses his job. He's sent into administrative exile, but because of the desperate need for technicians, he's eventually going to find work again as a mining consultant. But this experience working with the ministry, working with his previous colleagues, of being on the end of administrative exile, sours him to the established order, and his views become radicalized. And he's eventually going to come over to the side of the socialist revolutionaries, right? Those agrarian socialists. So this, in a microcosm, is the problem, or is the constellation of problems facing the state at the time. The treatment of reform-minded specialists like Palchinsky underscored the constraints on development posed by what was now Russia's archaic autocratic system. Technocratic officials like Witte promoted modernization through the appropriation and assimilation of foreign tools and techniques. but they resisted any alterations to the existing domestic order that might upset bureaucratic authority and autocratic prerogative. You don't want to, you're not going to impinge on the Tsar's power. The public possessed desires to have a more pluralistic political order, but those desires were ignored or disdained by the guardians of state power. Initiative occasionally is allowed at the ministerial level above, but initiative from below is condemned as a threat to the autocracy. So this is what you have. You've got a sclerotic institutional culture. It's like scleroses, right? Like a hardening of the arteries. It's, patronage, privilege, obeisance to authority meant that even the most innovative and forward-looking officials found it difficult to act decisively, if at all. So Tsarism, by this point, is a reactionary system. What reform comes arrives too little and too late to keep pace with the calls for reform by emerging civil society. Already in the early 1880s, it was becoming difficult to reconcile the principles of absolutism with the democratic demands of a public. By the mid-1890s, after the famine, it's all but impossible. In 1903, the Socialist Revolutionary Party embraces terrorism as a tactic for achieving the overthrow of the autocracy. And this is a very, very bad sign. In the years that followed, the section of the Socialist Revolutionary Party that was given the task of carrying out terrorism, it's known as the Combat Organization. The Combat Organization is going to transform targeted assassinations and politically motivated robberies into mass phenomenon. Reliable estimates indicate that in the last 20 years, the last 2 decades or so, 1903 to, let's say, 1917, the number of people killed or wounded as a result of revolutionary terrorism was around 17,000. 17,000 people killed in terrorist attacks each and every year. Now, to put that in perspective, I'm sorry, a total, so 17,000. To put that in perspective, that would be the equivalent roughly in per capita terms over the preceding 20 years, if around 35 or 40,000 Americans had died in terrorist attacks, or if you had 2,000 people killed in terrorist attacks. But these aren't just people. These aren't ordinary people. These are government officials. They would be the equivalent of sheriffs, of local judges, of members of state, municipal, and even federal government targeted for assassination. Can you imagine? I mean, the country's lost its mind as it is now, but can you imagine, what this would do to a polity when you have this level? You've got 1,000 people. In the American case, per capita, 2,000 people a year, thereabouts, being assassinated, government officials. Okay. This is the problem. It's a serious, serious problem. Russia is stumbling towards a revolutionary situation. Now, had Russia possessed a far-sighted leader who was forceful and bold, the country might have stood a chance. Unfortunately, it did not have that. Russia's last czar was weak and vacillating. Nicholas II was constitutionally ill-equipped to serve as a head of state, especially one presiding over a rapidly modernizing multi-ethnic empire that was racked with violence. He had a narrow, anachronistic worldview. It was defined by his unwavering commitment to autocratic prerogative. He had a mystical faith in the paternalistic bond between the Tsar and his people. He was oblivious to the daily travails of ordinary subjects. He was suspicious of members of his own bureaucracy. He was intellectually detached. He was indecisive. And he would contribute to the political paralysis that descended upon the empire in the last decade or so of Imperial Russia. It's the reign of Nicholas II that marks the onset of the autocracy's final crisis. The last act of Russia's imperial drama would begin with war. On the night of 8-9 February 1904, a squadron of Japanese vessels launched a surprise attack on the ships of the Russian Pacific Fleet anchored in Port Arthur. The daring raid would set in motion something known as the Russo-Japanese War, a year-and-a-half-long conflict that arose from Tsarist officials' conflicting visions of imperial destiny and the Japanese and Russian governments' mutually exclusive competition for influence over Manchuria and Korea. The soon-to-be completed Trans-Siberian Railway, which was constructed in large part to advance Russia's imperial pretensions in the Far East, would prove to be a major factor in provoking the Japanese attack. Once fighting commenced, however, excuse me, the single-track rail line proved inadequate to the logistic demands of transporting men and materiel. Both belligerent nations employed the latest military innovations in the course of the war. Rapid-firing artillery, machine guns, bolt-action rifles, hand grenades, barbed wire, electric fencing, all contributed to high casualty rates. At sea, the extensive use of mines, underwater torpedoes, the appearance of heavily armed ironclad battleships marked the onset of modern naval warfare. In the air, tactical radio signaling, radio jamming, tethered balloons, expanded communication capacities. Here's the irony, folks. The empire, Russian Empire, went into the battle with modern technologies. It had a modern military, but so did the Japanese. The Japanese had been aided and abetted by the British, who had been opposing Russia's imperial expansion for several decades and sent money and advisors and information to the Japanese to help them build up as a counterweight to Russia, as Russia and the British were involved in what was known as the Great Game, control over Central Asia extending into what was then known as Persia, now known as Iran. The onset of the Russo-Japanese War would prove to be an absolute catastrophe for the autocracy. It was an unmitigated disaster for Russia. The Battle of Port Arthur ended in a draw, but the attack enabled the Japanese Navy to seize the initiative, and the Japanese dominate the seas for the duration of the fighting. There's going to be a daring attempt made to send the Baltic fleet stationed at Kronstadt near St. Petersburg almost all the way around the world to the Far East, right, to provide naval reinforcements. It's a 9-month, 18,000-mile journey that begins with a farcical encounter when Russian warships mistake British fishing boats in the North Sea for Japanese ships. It ends in tragedy. The Baltic fleet arrives to engage in the calamitous Battle of Tsushima Straits. In short, the naval squadron is destroyed. The Russians are going to suffer a couple of disastrous defeats on land at Liaoyang and Mukden, and the Russians are going to have to sue for peace. It's a humiliating defeat for the Russians. As bad as the Crimean War was, remember the Crimean War? We talked about that some time ago. The defeat in the Russo-Japanese War was even worse. It produces a veritable outrage across Russian society. Russia is the first European power to lose to a non-European power in memory. It provokes absolute outrage. As bad news arrives into St. Petersburg and Moscow from the Far East, urban workers launch strikes in protest of the economic dislocation that was occasioned by the failing war effort. Liberal thinkers, members of other professional groups, rally behind a campaign for the creation of a national Zemstva assembly. The combat organization of the Socialist Revolutionary Party ratchets up its campaign of terror. In July of 1904, the Minister of Interior, a man by the name of Vyacheslav von Pleva, is assassinated by the SRs. Now, the Minister of the Interior this would basically be the equivalent if a revolutionary group, say Antifa, assassinated the head of the FBI. That's Minister of Interior is basically the head of what would be the equivalent of the FBI. The public was completely indifferent to this in 1904. The Russian public, no one cared. That's bad. That's really bad. So the popular mood ends up shifting in early January of 1905, following something that was known as Bloody Sunday. A group of peaceful protesters had gathered in St. Petersburg to petition Nicholas II for improvements in their factory working conditions. When they refused to disperse, army units using whips and sabers pummel them, beat them. They still won't disperse. The crowd grows to about 60,000 strong. Members of the elite Preobrazhensky regiment, you can see in this photograph from 1905, take up positions, and they fire on the crowd. An estimated 200 people are killed. Another 800 are going to be wounded in the ensuing volley. Children number among the casualties. The martyrdom of what comes to be known as the Bloody Sunday protesters shook imperial society to its core, and the event ruptures the last remaining bonds between the autocracy and the people. Massive strikes erupt across the country in protest of the killings. More than 400,000 workers put down their tools in January of 1905 alone. Zemstva representatives, professionals, other members of polite society petitioned the government for political reforms. They organized unions to promote their collective grievances. University students hold rallies. They burn portraits of the Tsar. They call for his overthrow openly. The disruptions grow so widespread that the Ministry of Education has to close most higher educational institutions for the remainder of the academic year. So they just shut them down into the summer. In mid-February, the Tsar would reluctantly agree to permit a popularly elected National Assembly known as the State Duma. So he's going to allow now an elected assembly. It's a concession. The decree announcing the assembly had the intended effect of calming the revolutionary storm, but it doesn't last. The respite doesn't last long. When it's revealed in late summer 1905 that representatives would be elected on the basis of a severely restricted franchise in order to ensure that the nobility control it, and that the Duma's function was to be completely consultative, in other words, it's not going to have any real power, public anger surged again. Another wave of strikes occurs. Students, professionals, factory workers. By mid-October of 1905, the first general strike in Russian history is underway. Nearly 2 million people take part. Businesses close. Newspapers suspend publication. Telegraph and telephone exchanges curtail operations. Traffic on the empire's rail network grounds to a halt. Right-wing groups and staunch defenders of the state took advantage of the mounting chaos to launch violent attacks on Jewish subjects. Thousands are going to be killed in a wave of anti-Semitic pogroms that sweep cities in southern Russia. Revolutionary sentiment roils the countryside. Peasant mobs set upon homes and the property of their social superiors. Theft, arson, murder, rape. They destroy 3,000 gentry estates, roughly 15% of the country's total provincial gentry estates are destroyed. Russia has not seen violence on this scale since Pugachev. That's how bad it is. Now faced with all of these mounting problems, Nicholas is going to be forced to give ground. He's only got two options: impose martial dictatorship and crush everyone, or give in. Senior military and political advisors implore him to give in. It's only after his uncle, the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, in the midst of a session of the Tsar's closest group of advisors, the Grand Duke, the Tsar's uncle, pulls out a revolver, sticks it to his head, and tells the Tsar if he doesn't give in, Nikolai Nikolaevich is going to blow his brains out. That's how bad the situation is. On the 17th of October, Nicholas finally relents. Finally relents on the 17th of October, and what he issues subsequently is something known as the October Manifesto. The October Manifesto grants basic civil liberties. It legalizes political parties. It broadens the franchise, and it establishes the Duma's right to confirm future laws emanating from the state and, quote, to participate in the supervision of the legality of the actions of the Tsar's appointed officials. Now, the government responds to the peasants' revolt by ending the redemption payments left over from the emancipation in 1861. When that doesn't quell the unrest in the countryside, the army is sent in, and there are punitive military expeditions. By the time the rebellion in the countryside is put down in the spring of 1906, it's estimated that 15,000 peasants had been executed, 20,000 or so wounded, and another 45,000 deported or sent into exile in Siberia. So a combination of grudging concessions and brutal repression keeps the autocracy from collapsing in 1906. But no sooner does the revolutionary tide begin to wane when the Tsar begins to walk back his promises. On the 23rd of April, 1906, just days before the convocation of the newly elected Duma, Nicholas issues something known as the Fundamental Laws. The Fundamental Laws reaffirmed his position as the nation's supreme autocrat and granted him sweeping powers over the Duma. The Tsar retained the right to determine the length of the Duma sessions. He had the right to dissolve the Duma before its members served their 5-year term. He had the right to legislate via emergency decree when the Duma was not in session. He also retained exclusive prerogative to appoint government members and to direct foreign policy and military affairs, including the right to go to war without consulting the Duma. The fundamental laws also established that legislation passed by the Duma could not become law until it was approved by both the Tsar and the State Council. The State Council was an old consultative body dominated by reactionary nobles. It now became elevated to the position of an upper chamber, so it becomes kind of like the Senate in the US, only it's completely controlled by the autocrat. Now, here is the problem, folks. We face now in 1906 the fundamental impossibility of squaring Nicholas II's conception of absolutist rule with society's desire for representative government. This fatally undermines Imperial Russia's brief experiment with quasi-constitutional rule. Nicholas is just absolutely opposed to the assembly he had created. He believed it had been forced upon him by the outbreak of revolution. And his actions only served to further antagonize society. Only 10 weeks after the first Duma is inaugurated, Nicholas dissolves it. The second Duma doesn't last much longer. The government then uses the proroguing of the second Duma to alter the election laws to ensure that the last two assemblies, the third Duma and the fourth Duma, are dominated by people who are supportive of the autocracy. The third Duma ends up being known publicly as the Master's Duma. Okay. And amidst all of this, as they're stumbling towards the onset of the Great War, the problems, the social dislocation, the political discontent emanating from rapid urbanization, industrialization, the concentration of the laboring classes in a few major cities, the growing expanse of terrorism, the growing activity of revolutionary groups like the socialist revolutionaries, like the social democrats, makes the situation in Russia highly unstable. There will be a respite of sorts between 1906 and 1914, 1915, when it appears that Russia the autocracy may have escaped the worst of the unrest. But with the coming of war in 1914, those hopes end up being shown to be false. The war is going to rend Russian society apart, although we're going to find out next time we meet that Russia does pretty well by it, all things considered. They last quite a while, but it's going to be the coming of war in 1914 and the stresses and strains of the Great War and the autocracy's growing inability to conduct the war satisfactorily that's going to lead to the fall of the House of Romanov in February of 1917. And the introduction of a brief caretaker government, which only lasts until October of 1917. We're going to cover the run-up to war the next time we meet. And in our last week, next week, we are going to cover the concentrated period between February of 1917 and the onset of what is known as the Bolshevik Revolution in October of 1917. And in that way bring an end finally to the imperial period of Russia's history.